listener production.
Hey, Tom with you for this episode of The Weekend Briefing, and this one is quite a thoughtful, gentle, introspective journey into the life and the characters of Patrick deWitt. He's a popular Canadian novelist who's in Australia at the moment. He's written 5 novels. His second book, The Sisters Brothers, was shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize, which is basically the most prestigious literature prize in the world, the English-speaking world. That book was turned into a film. His 4th book, French Exit, was also turned into a film starring Michelle Pfeiffer. So he's become really successful in recent years. And one of the things that's interesting about him is that he purposefully steers his stories away from the big issues of contemporary times and turns his focus into the timeless inner worlds of quite ordinary people living modest, sometimes bleak, often somewhat funny lives. I guess that describes many of our lives at different stages. There's a lot going on in his work, even though it might not appear so, especially with the main character of his new book. This character's called Bob Comet. He's a 71-year-old former librarian. Doesn't sound interesting at the outset, but that's the whole point. The book's called The Librarianist, and here's Patrick deWitt, who's here in Australia at the moment to talk at writers' events and promote this new book. Patrick, thank you so much for joining us on The Weekend Briefing.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Looking into your journey of leaving high school before you'd finished year 12, the way you spent your 20s working in a bar whilst writing during the day, it looks like you took a massive gamble with this career. For someone that published their first novel in your mid-30s, there were many years in between where it might not have looked that clear what was going on and no signs of a plan B. Is that fair to say that this career really was all or nothing and a big gamble for you?
Well, it was a sustained gamble. I think of a gamble as being something that occurs fairly quickly, like you roll the dice and then you win or lose. And this was something that was more, 10 or 15 years of toiling in a sort of vacuum before there was any sign of let's call it success. I guess the end zone being the publication of the first book. There were years during that period of time, which we could call my apprenticeship, where it seemed inevitable that I would succeed, and then it seemed at other times inevitable that I would fail. But I just sort of plodded along because it was what I enjoyed doing. It was the only thing I've ever really had any sort of sustained interest in.
And given you were doing this apprenticeship more or less on your own and not within an institution and all the structure that comes with that, there must have been a deep drive to keep you going, because it would be easy to lose your way when you're not following a course or, part of a community that's following a course.
Yeah, I think the lack of community was something that became wearisome for me. It wasn't necessarily at the start, but as the years sort of ticked by, I thought, none of my friends were readers, much less writers, or that some were sort of dabbled, but they weren't particularly serious about it. I was the only one in my group who had that particular drive and aim. So towards the end, I did lament that, and I felt like a strong pull to establish any kind of rapport with anyone else who was sharing the same dream as myself. But again, I was doing it because I enjoyed doing it, The lack of success wasn't too terribly disheartening because I knew that I was improving and the work was becoming more interesting to me.
So when did the idea to become a writer kick in? And was it before you walked out of high school in year 12? Did you already have the vision and decide that you didn't need to finish school to get there? Or did it all happen in a kind of different way to that?
No, that's more or less correct. By the time I was in my middle teens, before I was driving a car really, I had a sense of my wanting to involve myself with language. I wasn't quite sure if this would be poetry or short stories or novels or scripts or whatever, but I skewed as a reader towards one who really naturally was studying novels. And by the time I left school, I knew that was what my ultimate dream was. At the time, I was working more on short pieces and poems. I did have it in my mind clearly that I didn't need school because I knew what I wanted to do. And it seemed that so many of my peers were going to school to find out what they wanted to do, what position they wanted to hold. But I knew, or I thought I knew. So walking off wasn't that complicated, really. And I wasn't getting anything out of school. And I didn't particularly care for I liked my peers, but my instructors were lacking, I felt. And I wasn't learning anything. And I was quite lazy on campus. So yeah, stepping away was not something I was terribly conflicted about.
That's something you can easily put into words now, but can you remember how you explained it to your parents on the day that you walked out?
I don't remember, other than I'm pretty sure I didn't tell them right away. I was brought into the principal's office and it was explained to me that I wasn't going to graduate. It was midway through the 12th grade. No matter what, if I got straight A's, I still wasn't going to make it because my grades were had been poor enough over the years that I didn't have the credits to graduate. So I was going to have to do grade 12 again. And I knew I wasn't going to do that. So I sort of sat around school for the next 2 or 3 days wondering what to do and not really talking to anyone about it, certainly not my folks. And yeah, one day, midday, I just was, what am I doing? I'm wasting my time and their time. So I just walked off campus and drove home. And my parents must have figured it out sooner or later. They knew I was never going to be a scholarly type because it had been too many years of me flunking courses and not caring particularly. But they did see that I was sincere in my reading. And my father at the time was himself writing fiction. So he and I actually shared that. We would submit stories to the same literary magazines and things like that and be rejected side by side, which was quite sweet. They saw that I was sincere and they were supportive of my interest and encouraged me to go along with it. So my parents were both really kind and I think intelligent parents in that they didn't push. They didn't push us. They supported us and they were there for us.
Do you think they had to resist any desire to put pressure on you? Do you think they at times wanted to say, hey, you need to get a more solid career? Because your dad was out there on the building site, right? He had to get a day job, even though he wanted to be a writer as well and really engage with literature. So do you think they had to really think about that approach to parenting, or it came naturally?
Well, I remember my father's tack was he had gone to college. He'd gone to college for a couple of years, and he would always present it to me and my brothers as the funnest time of his life. He was trying to sell us on college as being joyful and celebratory. But I was already, and my brothers and I were already behaving in a celebratory manner. So how much more celebratory could it get? I wasn't necessarily looking for more celebration. So it didn't really take with me. Also, I was just so removed from the idea of, furthering my studies. There's such a thing, obviously, as MFA programs, creative writing programs. I didn't even really understand that was a thing. And if I did know about that, I might have looked into it and maybe I would have gone. And that would have been good and bad in any number of things. I suspect I'd be a different kind of writer if I'd studied under... If somebody had been leading the way, maybe I would have gotten to where I'm at sooner, but I probably would have arrived in a much different... I think the work would be different, And again, I who's to say it could be better? It could be worse. But I don't lament the course that I've taken because, I've arrived at the place I've arrived at in a natural sense. It's not nothing was forced, and I've arrived at this place comfortable with my work, and it feels personal. The work always feels personal to me. So I think that part of the reason of that is because I got here more or less on my own.
So you're happy with where you've got to?
Yeah, in that all I ever really wanted was to be allowed to spend time fiddling around with language. And, it has delivered. Oftentimes you aspire to something and then you arrive there and it doesn't feel quite the same as you'd imagined. But the lifestyle and the life that I was sort of daydreaming of for those years of my apprenticeship, it has delivered on its promise in that I feel that my work is meaningful to me, and I have a small readership who respond to the works that I put out, and they're fair in their assessments of it. And I don't have a boss. And Yeah, I'm pleased. It's honestly, it's gone better than I would have imagined, in that I've sustained this life for however many years now, 11 or 12 years. So to write full time is not. I'm very fortunate to be able to be in this position. So yeah, I am pleased with where I've landed.
So for people listening to this interview who've never heard of you before, the 5 books you've written sort of span quite different kinds of stories and different kinds of characters, some of them brash, and this most recent character, Bob, at the center of the Librarianist, is quite a withdrawn, isolated, old character. What is the Patrick deWitt thing? How would you sum it up? What do you think is the unique thing you're bringing to the literary world right now?
Well, I've been thinking about this because I hear from readers or from journalists that the books are all very different, and I suppose that it's the truth. But the through line to me, I guess I would say that it's the humor, the sharing of humor, and also the books are all about human behaviors, human interaction, the folly that often accompanies life. There's a fair amount of melancholy, I think, invested in all of the books, but the through line to me, or at least I hope what comes across, is my affection for and my affinity for humans and human behaviors, and just our small struggles, the little things that we get through in a day or in a lifetime. The comedy that accompanies our tragedy and vice versa. But it's very human-centric. I mean, you could say that about so many storytellers, but it's less about events, and it's much more about sort of like the mood that accompanies the events of our lives.
So this 71-year-old man at the center of the Librarianist, it appears on the outset there's almost nothing happening in his life. No friends, no family, no work. He just goes walking in his neighborhood every day. Is his story about loneliness?
Well, I don't know that Bob Comet would identify as lonely. I don't know that he'd be that self-aware even to lament the absence of people in his life. But something does occur in the book. There's a couple of different eras of his life where he's accepted as himself, as a peer among other people in minor communities. And it's never stated directly, but I do see these phases as being periods of relief for him. I don't think of him particularly as a sad character. I think that he would describe his own career path and his own life as being one where he did the things that he wanted to do. I think he found pleasure and joy and purpose in his vocation, which is the vocation of the librarian. I think he thinks of himself as a functional member of his community. Some people don't need sociability and human interaction as much as others do. And I think most artists, especially like with the solitary arts, writing, say, that's probably a relatable thing. I can relate to Bob's life, and I see it as a life well lived, though it is, of course, imbued with some personal tragedies, which is more or less what the book's about. It's an odd position to be in, the position of writer, because he or she is alone doing the work, and yet we're, for the most part, discussing social behaviors. So I feel connected with people on the one hand, and yet the bulk of my working life is spent in solitude. So it's just a strange contradiction.
Yeah, I heard a really interesting and I think poignant definition of loneliness recently. Someone said, loneliness is the gap between the social contact you want and the social contact you're getting. So someone, therefore, can be alone a lot of the time and not be lonely if they're not wanting to be with people any more than they are.
Yeah, and then also there's the sense of there's such a thing as loneliness in a crowd, which I'm familiar with, and I'm sure you are as well, where you're with people, but you feel that they're not seeing you for you, or you're not enjoying them, and you wish you were alone. I mean, I've left any number of social situations and feeling far less lonely alone in the cab after the fact than I was, surrounded by people. It depends, finding the people that are your people, I guess, is the great trick in life, right?
Well, I think it's a brave character to take on someone who spends a lot of time alone, because there's not the big obvious events that social connection that we so often write about. And, at the outset, if you look at this character of Bob Comet, you'd say, well, that's not an interesting person to be writing about. So was this the sort of brave kind of story you could only write in your fifth book and not, say, your first or second?
Yeah, I mean, the impulse was to write a character who, on the surface, did not seem worthwhile to write about. I don't mean worthy. I just mean because it is a quiet book and it's modest in its scope. He's not a character who cries out to have a novel written about him, I don't think. So that was an appealing thing to me, and I think that as a younger writer, that would have been more intimidating or foolhardy, or simply stupid. Why would I write about this person? I can't see the earlier version of myself wanting to or needing to write this character. I think that this character represents some shift in terms of my priorities as an artist. The idea being, as time passes, as a reader and writer both, wanting less, I suppose, without any sense of diminishment in terms of the quality of the work. Just wanting less as a reader, and then also just seeing more potential in a modest story. Certainly seeing more so more recently than I would have as a younger man.
Well, the thing is about a person who spends a lot of time alone, who may or may not be lonely in that state, is that if you have the ability to really write inside their head like you do, you realize that someone who is alone actually often has a lot of interesting things going on inside their mind. And one of those things are these reflections on key moments in life. And that's how you structure this book, with this old man going back to these critical moments in his earlier life. And then you open up worlds of experience and stories within the mind of someone who from the outside looks like they're not doing anything.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the definition of maybe loneliness to me, or one of the definitions of loneliness, is one who is alone and who is bored by the fact of his being alone. And I don't think of Bob as being bored in his mind. I think of Bob as having a very active mind. So as long as there's movement, you can be sitting alone in a room, but as long as you've got something to think about or ponder or wrestle with or consider or look back on, then that's time well spent to me. It's not something to lament, or it's not that's not a state of depression to me. If you've got nothing going on and you need other people there to fill the void or to make noise, then that's something else. But Bob's not like that,
I heard you say in a podcast recently that you've only in the latter years realised that as an artist you're an escapist. And it made me wonder what you want to escape from. You said that there's a lot you see in the world in this current age that you want to escape from, that you don't really like. And that strikes me as interesting in combination with what you just said, that this book was modest in its scope and ambition in terms of the range of story. Are those things connected?
Well, escapism can mean, I guess, any number of things. I think what I meant when I said it was, there's such a thing as an escapist who wants to read, sweeping fantasy novels, for example. That's not the kind of escapism I'm pointing to. I'm thinking of not necessarily wanting people to bring me, and I feel that this is true socially for me too. If a friend brings me tragic news or stress or strife of any kind, I have a tendency to feel hostility towards them. And, don't bring me bad news unless it's absolutely crucial, right? So when I think of escapism as a writer, as a reader, there can be bad news in it. I don't want to read, jolly fairy tales all my life, but I don't necessarily want anguish or ugliness, It's like I feel that it is a very crass and an ugly world that we live in, increasingly so. And I look so much as I can or care to. Of course, there's an obligation to pay attention to what's going on. And your response is your response. But I think there's something to be said for the fabrication of a private world, and that's sort of the root cause of my decision to be an author. I feel like I'm doing the world some very minor service by writing these works and sharing them with my readership. And I think anyone who comes to my work recognizes that they're not going to necessarily be punished, in the way that some artists are quite punishing.
What do you mean by that? What kind of punishing are you talking about?
I'm thinking for whatever reason of the director Lars von Trier, who's some of whose works I admire greatly, and he's a talented man. I'm not knocking him in particular. I mean, I guess I suppose I am actually, but some of the works, there's a sense of contempt for humanity in the works, and there's a sense of his wanting to harm the viewer, which is rooted in whatever it's rooted in, and perhaps I'm taking it in the wrong spirit, but I opt out. That's not the experience I'm looking for. I think that there's quite enough contempt pre-existing in the world without us relishing in it during our leisure time. I think that I'm looking for a measure of respect from the artists that I'm reading about. Respect not just for the reader, but respect for the characters in the books. So I think that that's probably mirrored also in my work. I have a tendency to feel a great affinity for my characters, even the ones who aren't particularly good people. Mm. And I think that there's something to be said for finding the good, or at least the useful human information in tragic or ungenerous characters,
Yeah, when I heard you say escapist, I obviously, having looked at some of your work, I knew you weren't talking about sci-fi. I took it to mean you weren't writing works that were engaging with the issues of our time necessarily, You weren't tapping into some of the contemporary social discourses around race or privilege, power, these sorts of things that are sort of sparking culture wars and driving political polarization. You were steering deeper into the inner world for experiences that are much more universal than the to's and fro's and the pressures and tensions of our current environment.
Yeah, contemporary society, I think for so many of us, it feels simply alienating or fraught to the point of it being distracting. And I guess I'm looking for a more, stories that are more or less out of time. Mm. I don't advise any other artist to do this. It's just in terms of my own peace of mind, I find that I can relax into a story as an author that isn't necessarily addressing what's actually occurring today in the world. I don't know why that is, and again, I don't know if that's right or wrong, but it's just where my heart goes.
Well, it also really dates your work to do that.
Yeah, anything that's up to the minute, I'm wary of. Yeah, because I do take it in the long view, and I do hope that my work would be relevant, decades from now.
Something you are doing differently, at least with these last two books, is writing about older people that are older than you, people that are way older than the average person alive in Western countries. So in French Exit, it's about this rich woman, Frances, who's 65 years old, from a wealthy family, runs out of money and leaves to Paris. It's called French Exit. Again, this one, The Librarianist, we're talking about an 71-year-old man. Why are you doing that?
I did it subconsciously or without really realizing I was doing it in French Exit. But with Librarianist, it was much more overt and, like a hardline decision. I was assisting pre-COVID at a senior center near my home in Oregon. And I would go in and I would read to the men and women at this senior center. And I was doing it just to do it. And it bled into my work because I found the world to be worth discussing. And I found the people to be inspirational in some way.
And for our listeners, that's what Bob Comet, the character, does as well.
Right.
He volunteers at an old person's home and tries to read stories.
Yeah. And I had the similar experience of trying to read, and sometimes it would take, and sometimes the stories were rejected. And the experience of helping out at the senior center was almost thoroughly positive for me. And I really came away from that experience recognizing that seniors in our society are essentially invisible. And especially in our culture, in the arts, it's very much skewed towards the young. And that seems wrong to me. I think that there should be equal coverage and equal discussion across the ages, and that age should be not irrelevant, but it shouldn't be certainly reason to disengage with anyone. I'm not getting any younger. I'm still youngish, I guess, middle-aged, but I'm at the age where you begin to think about time in a different way. And that I've written 5 books is bizarre to me, and it seemed that there was something to be done about it, some stories to be told about it, increasing the visibility of seniors and pointing out the realities of their lives. Seems as important as telling stories of young heroic types.
Well, with the flexibility you have with literature, you can jump back into any part of their life as well and write about it, how that pieces together with who they've become. So it then becomes appealing or, relatable to anyone, because we're all wondering how our lives are going to pan out, whatever age you are. I think that's a really interesting point you made about youth culture. It's really why I asked the question in the first place, because yes, so much of our art worships the young. And yeah, like you, myself, even getting this side of 40, you're like, what, do people from this age, are they not interesting? It's like, no, quite the opposite. In fact, sometimes you're so simplistic and void of experience and knowledge in your 20s that you're actually not that interesting. You're just full of energy and searching and hoping, and like the much deeper reflection and personal convictions kick in later on.
Yeah.
And the stakes are raised too. More can go wrong. You've got more to lose later on in life as well. So there's so much to unpack there. And I think certain mediums are worse at this than others. I think music is one of the worst. Music seems to stay really young, and maybe that's because music's the business model has changed, where it's a lot about live shows now and less about recording rights, and that means only young people are going to spend the money or have the energy to get out on a weeknight. Books do seem to do it a little bit better than music.
They do.
But yeah, our culture worships the young. And do you think that comes at a cost?
Well, yeah, I think that it's such a fascinating thing, especially when you're thinking about an artist who's worked over a space of decades or across his or her whole life, to look at such a various body of work, starting from when the person was, say, in his 20s, and then ending up closer to the end. Somebody, just off the top of my head, somebody like Leonard Cohen, for example. What a strange, rich body of work. And part of that story is that it took place across decades. And how did he change? How did he shift? It's just so fascinating to me. Somebody who's engaging with the medium across decades rather than somebody who's just starting out. I think with music, as you say, it skews young. I think so much of it has to do with our ideas of what's beautiful, physically beautiful. Young people traditionally are better looking according to the rules of our society. But I do think it's a missed opportunity, and I think that middle-aged artists and senior artists could do with a bit more support, and certainly in the musical medium, because it can be very crippling for an artist for the interest to dry up and vanish, disheartening to the point of perhaps spoiling the medium for the artist. As you say, though, I think the book world is a bit fairer about it all. So I don't have much to complain about, but
well, the readers are older. That's where the market is for books.
Yeah, it's true. So I don't have much to complain about personally, but it was something I was thinking about at the outset of writing this book, which is just sort of like, why do we focus so much on youth? And is it just aesthetic? Like what is it? I think rock and roll generally is young. It's a young person's medium.
It's about rebellion. It's where your mind is at that in those younger phases, right?
It translates as or like punk rock, for example. I mean, there's such a thing as older men and women in punk rock, but generally speaking, you're thinking about people in their teens and 20s, and that's probably as should be. But I think we have to make room for artists as they age and as they shift and change. And it's the changing of the artist over the decades that's something that we should be paying attention to, because it's fascinating. The journey of an artist across decades is a strange one, and it's worth studying to me.
But maybe it's only interesting to other people who've traversed the decades as well.
Well, we're talking about this, and I'm thinking of myself in my 20s, and I couldn't have cared less about, it's irrelevant. I don't mean to say that I didn't care about older artists. It was just sort of like I would never have thought of it being, it's definitely somebody in his middle age. It's the epiphany or the realization of somebody who is himself aging, all of this. So, in my 20s, it would just never have occurred to me.
Totally. So before, when we were talking about escapism and you talked about the world being somewhat painful at the moment, what are you talking about? What is it about contemporary society that you enjoy escaping from?
I mean, the political situation in the United States of America, the divide of that country, the irreparable divide of that country, the vitriol, the small-heartedness, the small-mindedness. It's a vicious situation in the United States of America. And you're reminded of it constantly. And there is a part of me, and I'm sure a part of many people, who want to check out because it's not improving, and I don't see that it's going to. I don't see how it can. So I begin to take it as a personal, what can I do to help? First of all, what can I do so that I feel fulfilled and happy, which I think should be most people's goal, so that you feel useful and that you're making use of your time and you're not wasting your finite time. And then also, what can I do to, at worst, not hurt, but at best, perhaps help in some small way? And I think that the telling of stories, the retelling of stories, the perpetuation of human narratives can be soothing. I don't flatter myself. I'm not changing anyone's life, but I know that certain of my readers take my books as time well spent, and this is my very minor contribution. I guess the idea is that somebody could pick up a book of mine, and while they're in the universe of the book, they're not thinking about the divide. They're thinking about something smaller and something realer, ultimately, and something more human. But the world is in a shambles, it seems to me. I don't know how else you could describe it.
I wonder whether it just feels more like it's in a shambles because of the way media works now, that we are all part of this global audience where we, through digital and social media rather than our more localized traditional forms of media like local radio, television, newspapers, where we're reading about problems from all over the world now rather than just assessing threats in our immediate community, and that amplifies how bad the state of the world is. And, we've talked about aging. Another trope is that as you get older, you get more pessimistic about the future and the youth of today.
Yeah.
Are you falling victim to that, or are you really seeing signs? You throughout your life, you've lived up and down the west coast of America and Canada, starting out in British Columbia and then spending time in Hollywood, Southern California, moving up now into Portland, Oregon. Are you seeing it in real life, this division and pain that you're talking about, or is it just this amplified media portrayal of it?
I think it's a bit of both, honestly. It's absolutely amplified, and it's surely not as ubiquitously horrific as the media leads us to believe. I just drove from Portland to Los Angeles and back by myself, and the West Coast is a bit of a bastion for liberals and lefties, so it's not the greatest barometer of what's happening in the United States of America. But time after time, I would stop, and I don't have a smartphone, so I get lost. So I have to stop and ask people directions. And time after time, I met people, strangers, who were helpful, charming, friendly, curious. The world is still the world, and I think that mankind at its best is a force for good. I don't hold out much hope, frankly. I don't know. Things feel very dire in the States right now, and it is real. It's the divide is real. I mean, the reality of the divide is in the numbers, and in the people that we vote in, and at a certain point, I'm fairly checked out. To be honest, I don't have internet at home. I read the newspaper. I know what's going on, but only so much as I can stand it before it begins to feel like it's making me ill. More and more, I find myself sort of retreating into the world of books and language, which makes more sense. It just makes sense to me. It's a world that makes sense to me. And I think that oftentimes you see people, I mean, any news organization in the United States of America is pumping out truths about mankind at its worst. But it's not the full scope portrait, of course. So I think that you find the full scope portrait in literature, or you can find it there. And that portrait is more optimistic, because I think that, as I say, stopping and asking somebody for help, asking a stranger for directions, there's a real potential for generosity there, and I find people rise to the occasion over and over again. So if you're stuck at home alone and you've got a television or if you've got internet, like, you're going to establish that mankind is absolutely and utterly doomed and that there's no hope. But if you drive around a bit, if you speak to strangers, then I think that tempers that opinion somewhat. People aren't. It's not as bad as it's made out to be, I suppose. But it's also, it is a grim reality. Any way you cut it, whether or not it's being exaggerated, it's a hard time.
Yeah, it sounds like you hope that in some small way, what you described your through line as a uniquely humorous take on the inner life of, at times, ordinary people. It sounds like you are creating that somewhat as an antidote to just modern life.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly a gesture. It's just heartfelt. It's just what comes out. But I do think of it as being a gesture of not an olive branch, but I do have an enormous affinity and love for human beings, and all of our foibles and all of our trials and travails and our disappointments and our triumphs. The small human stories make sense to me, and a large part of the job of the novelist, I think, is it skews sort of sociological. It's just ultimately the study of human behaviors. And in studying human behaviors for however many years it's been, I feel as deep a love for the individual as I ever have. It's the mass that I'm concerned about. It's the group of us that makes me uneasy.
Yeah, well, we spent time in the micro headspaces of these characters to a fascinating and cozy degree in many ways, and follow their journeys, and very much steer clear of those macro driving forces that are causing so much tension in the world. I'll be interested to see what you do next, Patrick. Thank you so much for taking the time to explore your work with us.
Thank you. Have a good day.
That was Patrick deWitt, Canadian author, talking about his book, The Librarianist, and his whole career there. Also check out French Exit or The Sisters Brothers if you want to check out more of his books. A really interesting, thoughtful conversation there with Patrick deWitt. We'll have another big one for you next weekend on The Weekend Briefing. In the meantime, if you're enjoying this podcast, please subscribe or follow in whatever app you're listening to us from. Rate and review. Help boost us in the algorithm. Thank you very much, and goodbye.
Listener.